In the last week alone, demand for mortgages fell 7% in the U.S., hitting its lowest point since the year 2000, according to the Mortgage Bankers Association's seasonally adjusted index. Sky-high inflation and rocketing interest rates have set many Americans back from the dream of home ownership, and there seems to be no sign of reprieve anytime soon. The Federal Reserve is expected to hike rates by another 75 basis points next week.
With inflation on everyone's minds, we wanted to get to the bottom of what really causes it. So our next two guests are here to help us do just that. Pavlina Tcherneva is an associate professor of economics at Bard College, a research scholar at the Levy Economics Institute, and author of The Case for a Jobs Guarantee. And E.J. Antoni is an economist at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having us.
I'm going to start with you, Pavlina. So give us the lowdown. We only have a limited number of time to obviously discuss a very complicated subject, but what, in the short summation, what is causing inflation and what should we do about it?
Well, the largest contributor to inflation is energy. We have had rolling shutdowns for the last few years and a huge disruption to production. And so the supply chain issues are familiar to everyone. And so we are emerging out of an unprecedented period where production needs to adjust. And we are now facing an energy problem that has to filter through the rest of the economy. As you know, energy is an input of production for every other product. And so it has transferred to headline inflation. But there is some sign that might be turning around. So next month's numbers are going to show a clearer picture.
And EJ, what do you say is primarily driving our inflation right now, and what do you want to see done?
Well, it's a combination of bad fiscal and monetary policy. On the fiscal side, we have an administration who declared war on reliable domestic American energy before they were even inaugurated. That war began on the first day in office. It continues to this day. On the monetary side, we have a Federal Reserve that has essentially functioned as the financing arm of a spendthrift Congress and president, and that has put upward pressure on prices, not just in the energy sector, but everywhere. And so the solution to that is, number one, for this administration to get their boots off the necks of American energy producers, allow them to bring their product to market, and then for the Federal Reserve to do its job and to maintain stable prices.
Pavlina, how would you respond to that?
Well, this is all well and good to increase energy production in the United States, but we simply don't have the capacity to do that. The three largest producers of oil in the world are the US, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. So you just have to look at the numbers. During 2020, there were huge declines in production of oil. Saudi Arabia has caught up and tried to kind of match its production quotas prior to the pandemic. Russia has not. So we actually have a shortage in supply. The US simply cannot meet that shortage. We don't have the capacity to produce. I also don't think this is necessarily the right way to go about it. Let's just, drill to address the energy problem. We have an environmental problem to address, and there are other ways that we can do this. On the fiscal side, let's just be also very clear. We have shut down the economy. The private sector stopped spending and producing and employing. Somebody had to fill the gap. So the government stepped in with the necessary spending, and it really did the right thing because we experienced the shortest recession in our post-war history. It brought us back to previous growth levels, restored incomes, but it did not accelerate spending beyond anything we've seen in recent history to merit this analysis that it's the demand side that is driving inflation.
EJ, the Biden administration, is seeking better relations with Saudi Arabia after trashing them for a period of time, hoping to get more oil that way. But then at the same time, domestically, talks about renewables and needs to transition away from oil, from fossil fuels. Then, put all these tariffs on Russia, is giving money to Ukraine to help defend them and have the war effort continue. Is the energy policy of the country right now just totally confusing to normal people? What is the energy policy?
In a word, counterproductive. This administration goes on its hands and knees to foreign countries to beg for more production when we could have more production right at home. I really love the idea of looking at the numbers. Let's look at the numbers. We are down in terms of production compared to the pre-pandemic peak. So far from this idea that we are somehow running out of energy here at home or we don't have the capacity. No, we do. But this administration repeatedly sends signals to the energy markets not to produce, not to bring product to market. And again, they have done everything they can to stop production, to stop growth in production. And instead of actually concentrating on increasing that production here at home, we're doing things like tapping our strategic petroleum reserve and sending the oil to China, our number one adversary right now.
Yeah, Pavlina, what do you think about that?
Listen, there are permits that can be explored. This is not the way to address the inflation problem. We have many other costs to production. We have tariffs that were implemented by the Trump administration and President Biden decided to keep. We can repeal those and immediately offer some reprieve on more expensive goods that are coming from abroad. There are various strategic investments that can be made to alleviate pressure on the supply chain. Keep in mind, we have had kind of decades of disinvestment. Our productive capacity has come down over the decades, and I'm talking about since the 80s, and our capacity utilization is still rather low. So we have ways to go with strategic targeted direct investments where we can actually relieve some of the supply pressures that are contributing to inflation.
Yeah, EJ, the tariffs are an interesting point because were implemented by President Trump, and tariffs are something that many free market kind of conservative Republicans have been against, but Donald Trump was somewhat breaking from some of the previous consensus in the party on free trade, et cetera. What's your view of that, and should those policies be gotten rid of?
Well, the idea that the tariffs are somehow a large contributor to inflation is really just nonsense, because if they were, then we would have seen that inflation begin when Trump implemented them, not all of a sudden miraculously now that Biden is president. But that being aside, to address your point, what the Trump administration did with these tariffs was they specifically focused on goods where Americans had alternatives, either alternative sources or alternative products. And so what that did is it caused the Chinese producers of those goods and services basically to eat over 80% of the tariff. In other words, the vast majority of those cost increases were not borne by the American public. They were borne by the Chinese government, aka the Chinese taxpayer. So far from this idea that they are somehow contributing to large price increases here at home, instead what they are doing is counteracting the subsidies of the Chinese Communist Party, which have been used essentially to drive manufacturing and jobs out of this country and overseas.
Mm-hmm. Pavlina, I want to give you the last word. What do you think about getting rid of the tariffs?
Look, I think that they don't help. It's an increased cost. It's just a very standard, straightforward tax on production. We could talk about tariffs, more, but I need to say something about Fed policy. Raising interest rates is really the wrong way to go about fighting inflation. Interest rates are also a cost of production. We are seeing that, loan volume actually is increasing. These are going to be costs that will be passed on to the consumer for some time to come until rates become high enough, if the Fed is willing to go that way, and crushes the economy. We have seen this scenario before. It has very devastating social consequences. We do not want, the Fed cannot engineer soft landing, and we don't want to go down that path. There are other ways to fight inflation.
And what's your view, EJ, on raising interest rates?
Well, let's put this in context. When the Biden administration first took office, right, if we compare price increases annually, that is about the rate at which prices are increasing monthly right now. So inflation has skyrocketed. It is a result of the government spending, borrowing, and printing far too much money, and the Federal Reserve needs to get its act together. Again, further context, the last time inflation was this high, the key Federal Reserve interest rate was over 13%. Today it is less than 2%. So the Fed is laughably behind the curve, and the idea that we can somehow fight inflation without rates going up is equally laughable.
All right, well, I'm so grateful to both of you for joining me to hash this out. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this.